This is our June session. You will kind of see me kind of bouncing around, and you'll see that delay a little bit. We have a simulcast going live out, so we have people sitting on their computers watching in as well as our chamber partners that host their own simulcast from their location and have a room full of people as well. So welcome. We are going to be talking about HR and policies and handbooks today, and we're happy to have Scott here donating his time to get us educated on what we need to know. And we know there's more than 5 things you need to know, right? But he's going to hit on those kind of 5 very important things that you need. And then if you have other questions, I'm sure Scott will hang around afterwards and ask questions. For those watching in online, we are going to test a chat feature today. So if you have a question, please type it in. Mike is watching for those. And the last 15 minutes will be reserved for questions. We also are missing 10 people, so you might see heads popping in via simulcast, people walking in and grabbing their seat. We're missing about half the people today, so bear with us if they block your view for a minute. Scott is the Director of HR Operations with Aureon HR, and he leads the team of HR professionals who consult with their business leaders on the achievement of their strategic initiatives. He has over 20 years of experience in HR resources and training in the service industry, and he truly understands the power of human capital and its impact on the business. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you. So am I standing here? Okay. Thought maybe this was the dark spot. Thank you, Christina, for the intro, and I think she's probably told you enough about what I do with Aureon. Before I get too far into this, I want to quickly just make mention of a few other people in the room from Aureon. Jason Lamping is here as a marketing manager with our organization. We have Nikki Beecham here, she's in business development with our staffing piece of the organization. And then along the back, we have some other folks from our business development side of Aureon HR as well. So we travel in a pack. So just a little bit about, if you want to go to the next slide, or do I have a clicker?
Yeah, we do have a clicker.
Okay.
That would be convenient.
That's all right. We're keeping it real. How many people are familiar with Aureon HR? Couple, the PEO organization. This is just a little blurb about what we do from the Aureon HR perspective. We're part of a larger organization that provide business office solutions for a variety of things, from IT to the HR side to staffing. And so the staffing piece of the organization, which isn't called out here, but Nikki works in that part of our business and works with temp to hire, direct hire staffing needs for clients. So just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of who we are. The Aureon HR portion of our business was formerly Merit Resources, which, for if you weren't familiar with Aureon, you may be familiar with that. We've been around since 1989. So the first question, well, actually, before I get into that, if anyone here is there anybody who has an HR certification? Let's just start it that way. Okay. So Nikki has the certificates for SHRM as well as HRCI, and then there's also an accounting document of some sort. I'm not an accountant. I'm not sure what that exactly is, but she has that if there's a credit that somebody needs from an accounting perspective. So you'll need to see her after the session, and she'll get you hooked up with the information you need with that. The first question I had, was what interested you? And first of all, don't judge my PowerPoint skills. I realize I covered over part of a word there this morning, and I'm like, I can't change it because I've already sent this in. But just kind of generally, what interested you in the session? What made it seem interesting, or what something you would want to attend? And anybody, I'm not going to go around the room and ask everybody, but anybody have any? Yes?
Organization, and so we don't have an HR person. So the two of us divide and conquer as much as we can amongst ourselves. So we just want to know what we don't know. And if it's the top 5 and we don't know, then we're going to need more help.
All right. Anybody else?
Yeah, we are in the process of redoing our employee handbook, so just kind of getting new ideas and for policies or sort of incentives for the employees.
Any other?
Making sure we're not missing something.
Say that again.
Making sure I'm not missing something.
Make sure you're not missing something, okay? And anyone else? I know did I hear you say you were in HR? Or-
No, I'm filling in for HR.
You're filling in for, okay, all right. Great. So the other question I have, just to give me a sense, because I do, so I make sure I don't want to under-explain things or over-explain. So give me a sense of how many people work in an HR role. So about half, okay. And we'll assume that carries through with those on listening in from afar. Outside of that, give me an idea of what role you have. Owner, okay. Owner. Okay. Anybody? Okay, okay. Just so I have a sense, like I said, I don't want to, some of the terminologies or the acronyms, I don't want to fly through them. And if there's any point where I say something, you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, please let me know. So why do we need an employee handbook? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Well, what's the purpose? There is a school of thought out there from some people that don't think you do. I'm not one of them. Any thoughts on why? What's the purpose of having one? Consistency is a great point. I think you'll see that come up.
Violation with employees.
Say that again.
Communication with employees.
Communication to the employees regarding company.
I can't remember what I said last.
Okay. So a reference.
Clarity.
Yeah, good.
Clarity is a good.
Clarity.
Clarity.
Yep. Yep. And handbooks can be as detailed as possible or as brief as necessary. Ours within Aureon, I think, is over 200 pages, which I will say is on the over detailed end. Most are not nearly that extensive, but ours includes travel policies and things that, maybe not in everyone's. So first reason, there are, I think, 6 reasons that I put together as far as why you would need a handbook. So it introduces the employee to your culture, your mission, and your values. So this is a great intro coming out of probably the interview process where you may have explained it, and then this puts it into a little more, it articulates it a little more formally. It's important, to keep in mind, and some of these are no-brainers, but I apologize, I'm going to say them anyway, that what you're placing in there, if you're going to talk up that our culture, believes in work-life balance, that what you do on a day-in, day-out basis really needs to echo that. The second one is it communicates to employees what is expected of them. This is critical. Now, also, I will make note that we all realize that there are many employees who've never read the employee handbook. Matter of fact, there may be people in this room who've never read their employee handbook, and I'm not here to judge. But it's still important to have it as the framework, as a reference, or as just a basis for doing what you do. And it will come in very handy when it comes to litigation, if that ever comes into play. And some employees do use it as a reference as well. It educates the employees about what they can expect from their company. And that's kind of soup to nuts as to what may be included in that portion. Helps ensure consistency in making key policies. So back to the consistency point and making sure everyone's operating under the same rules and regulations, as if you will. Ensures compliance with federal and state regulations. This is key. And this is where, when putting together a top 5 policies you need to have in your handbook, and I'll say handbook and policies kind of interchangeably because some of them may be placed in an actual handbook and some may be just separated, but it's very difficult because depending on the industry you work in, you may have regulations that you're required to have, especially if you're in a union environment, you're a federal contractor. Some regulations are based on the size of your organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I've just chosen fairly generic ones that I feel would be applicable to most, if not all. And then the real big key piece of this is defense against employee claims. All of our clients that we work with at Aureon HR are covered under our EPLI insurance, or Employment Practices Liability Insurance. So as you can imagine, overseeing a team of 11 HR business partners that I do that work with a large number of clients, we see a lot of claims come through. And a lot of them funnel up through me, so I see a lot of the things that are done correctly or incorrectly from a client perspective as they become a claim. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that. So the first policy that we'll talk about, and these aren't really in any particular order, they sort of flow in some respect, but is an equal employment opportunity policy. You may feel like this goes without saying, of course we are, but it comes up many times in a claim of discrimination or disability. The first question an attorney will ask is, do you have an equal employment opportunity policy? So it's really important that you have it in writing, stating that your commitment as an employer not to discriminate against those employees working for you. There's a prohibition against harassment of any kind within the workplace. A reference to the process to report suspected discrimination or harassment. Well, that is a separate policy, and it actually is one of my top 5, and we'll get to that in a lot more detail. And then a commitment to providing reasonable accommodations. Now, not every employer has to work with the ADA. It's 15 employees or more. So there may be some small organizations that this may not 100% apply, but it's no matter what, it's good information, especially if you're in an employer that is growing. There are a lot of regulations that have, a set number of employees before you become required to comply, and without realizing it, you may jump into that category if you're not aware of where those stop points are. So the anti-harassment and discrimination policy is the next one, and it really truly is one of probably the most important. It is one that came on the scene loud and clear at the end of last year with the Me Too movement, Time's Up, specifically related to sexual harassment in the workplace. It should be designed as an education to your entire team as to what the expectations are, is designed as a protection for employees. And from an employer perspective, the intention is to reduce your claims and the costs of litigating. And then just kind of reaffirms your cultural aspect of it being a great place to work. I mean, people want to know that when they come to work for an organization that there's some safety involved in being there. So having this written and spelled out very clearly is really important. What would you include in your anti-discrimination? Well, actually, I'll get to that. I'm sorry, I stuck this one in at the last minute. So these are statistics from the EEOC for 2017. Just a couple things to point out. You'll notice that the sex discrimination, based on what I just said with Me Too and Time's Up, you would think between 2016 and 17 that number would have grown significantly. Well, if you remember, most of that didn't really hit the scene until October last year. So there really probably wasn't enough time to really impact that number significantly. I would bet that when we look at 2017 to 2018 numbers, there will be a significant change. But the key piece of all of this is this retaliation piece, and I highlighted it in red. Retaliation continues to grow, and if I had other years on here, you'll see that number just get larger and larger, to where it's almost 50% of claims. That is a huge concern. Now, a lot of the retaliation claims they're not won by the employee. These are just claims that have been made. And many of them are due to, really simply, an employment action was taken right after they maybe made a workers' comp claim. Now, you may have been working up to this for a long time, and then that was the day that you decided to terminate the person or make it, some sort of a change to their employment. But because of that correlation of time, it becomes, in the minds of the employee, a retaliation claim. Again, that doesn't mean they're going to win. It doesn't mean that anything was done incorrectly. It's just the timing. So it's just something you want to keep in mind. And I'm not definitely not insinuating to keep somebody that's a horrible employee, because sometimes it's worth taking the chance. But as long as you have the documentation leading up to it, we have a couple in place right now that's exactly what happened. There was some work being done on collecting documentation and really moving toward termination, and literally the day before they were going to do it, there was a workers' comp claim, and they went ahead and moved forward with it because they had done their due diligence and figured out that this person needed to go. Well, he filed suit. We're still fighting with it right now, and this has been, gosh, a year and a half, 2 years that's gone on, and that's where the cost really comes in. Would we have done anything different? Probably not, but it's just, one of those situations that can occur. Just something to keep in mind. The other thing is just a call out. This is only claims that are submitted to the EEOC. So this would preclude anything that's like Iowa Civil Rights Commission and some of the state-related agencies, and all lawsuits. They're not counted in this number. So some go directly to an attorney, and the next thing you know is you get served with papers and sued. Others go through channels like this and go to the EEOC. Questions about anything so far? Anything about that?
So how does it get to EEOC? Just the employee that got the phone call them?
That's exactly right.
How do they know to do that? Did we put it in the handbook?
We do not give the number. They're very quick at figuring it out. I wouldn't know personally.
I didn't know they existed.
Yeah. They have their ways. I'm assuming Google searches could provide you the numbers right off the bat. I've never actually researched it myself, but it's definitely not something we advertise, but they do find a way of doing it. The other thing also I will mention, these numbers don't add up because from experience I will tell you, you will get one claim and they'll claim age, sex, and race all in one. So they're captured in all different categories. And then the retaliation might be also a part of it. It's like click every box. So certainly, it's designed to protect employees from employer practices, but at the same time, it just should be creating an awareness on our end of things that we really need to avoid to keep us from getting in this place. And a lot of it is documentation. It is really, I can't tell you how many times you get to a point where someone has a claim, and the first thing you hear, in our situation, we're working with clients where they say, oh, this person is a horrible employee, we were going to terminate them. And it's like, well, I probably wouldn't recommend doing that today. And if you were going to do that, why did we wait? And so it's kind of a hard lesson to learn, but the documentation piece of it, I mean, we talk till we are blue in the face. It's hard to do. It's not something anybody wants to do. It's a lot of work, without a doubt. But just keeping records of things that are occurring and addressing behaviors that are not really appropriate for work as you go is extremely important. So things you will want to include in your anti-harassment and discrimination policy is really a detailed explanation of what is prohibited conduct. Now you would think, and I think about this with all these policies that we're talking about, it's like it should be a one sentence, be professional, whether it's related to the code of conduct. Well, that's not clear enough for a lot of people. So same thing with this. What is deemed harassment? Examples, give detailed explanation of what is prohibited in the workplace. And this list can go on and on. There are a lot of things that can be listed. Protection against retaliation. Again, that's the key, as you can see from the EEOC statistics, that is the largest number of claims they're receiving. So it's important that the employer make note that they will not be retaliated against for bringing a claim forward, participating in an investigation, or anything related to that. Clear description of the complaint process, include more than one option for reporting. This is important because a lot of the first line of defense for a team member or employee to report a claim is their supervisor. Well, what are they supposed to do if the supervisor was the person they're complaining about? So if you haven't given that second alternative or route of complaining, that is going to be a challenge. So you'll want to make sure they have more than one way of doing it. It doesn't have to be two, at least two. And again, in a situation with us working with clients, we a lot of times are the other route that they can take. We have hotline numbers that they could call, or they can call their HR business partner from Aureon. But that's important to have more than one. Assurance of confidentiality to the extent possible. It is impossible to guarantee someone complaining about harassment that it will be kept confidential in most cases. Because you've got, in order to investigate, you're going to have to ask some people some questions unless you saw it yourself. So it's, you know, a statement you'll want to make in writing as well as when doing an investigation that, you know, we will do everything we can to keep this confidential, and I ask that you do the same. But at times it's just impossible. So we don't want to give a promise that's not going to be possible to follow through with. The next one, a complaint process that provides a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation. Again, just reassuring them that any complaints will be responded to promptly, they will be followed through with, and investigated as appropriate. And then the key piece of this is that then you follow back up with the person who made the complaint and let them know what exactly happened. I will also say that there's a lot of confusion from an employee who makes a complaint. Once they made the complaint, they feel like nothing's happening. So ongoing communication through that process is really important. Some things take a while. I mean, sometimes I think they have an idea by noon today you'll have an answer to them. It doesn't work like that. So you're gonna, you'll want to communicate pretty regularly with them throughout, and then provide with them what the findings were. It shouldn't be a secret. We've investigated. We did not find that there was anyone at fault. It was a misunderstanding, whatever the case may be. Or it could be that the person, it was loud and clear and the person no longer is employed there. But no matter what that is, it needs to be followed back through with the person who made the complaint to let them know that it was resolved. Guarantees that the company will take immediate and appropriate action if violations have occurred. Again, kind of going back to what I've already said, just spelling it out in writing that it will be investigated and the proper action will be taken. And then lastly, training and the signed handbook acknowledgement. These are crucial. Again, the first thing you're going to be asked in a situation of a harassment or discrimination, do you have a harassment and discrimination policy? If so, do you have a signed acknowledgement from the employee that they have read and understand it? I also recommend that this particular policy, because it does come up a lot, is trained on an annual basis in one fashion or another. A lot of businesses have regular monthly type meetings. It could just be covered at something like that. It's never a bad idea to take attendance when you're doing things like that, just as another double check that, yeah, they signed the acknowledgement 10 years ago, but we also did training last week so that we have all the necessary things that just, again, assuring an attorney that they were fully aware of what the policy was. Questions about that one? It's like the one thing nobody really wants to deal with, but it happens.
It's not specific to the policy, but do you recommend your clients have employees sign the handbook annually, acknowledge the handbook annually, or?
No, not necessarily. I'll talk about later. We do recommend a review of your handbook annually, and if changes need to be made, then another acknowledgement would be completed. The more things you can do to pull things out of the handbook and review on a regular basis, I think is good. So if you do have meetings and you want to talk about specific policies at each one, again, document attendance to these meetings, never a bad idea. Because otherwise, a lot of the handbooks sort of just sit and collect dust and they're only used when needed. So any kind of ongoing references back to them are good, but as far as getting it signed every year, not necessary. Third policy.
1 second. I actually got a question that just popped in online. Looks like Stephanie from IMF wants to know, in cases where there aren't witnesses, is documentation of unfavorable employee behavior signed and dated by owner or manager enough to track an employer's issues leading to their termination?
Okay, say that one more time.
In cases where there aren't witnesses, is documentation of unfavorable employee behavior signed and dated by owner or manager enough to track an employee's issues leading to their termination?
Possibly. So the he said, she said moments, which is what this is, or he said, she said, are where the investigation gets very tricky. And I actually last week went to the National SHRM Conference, which you may or may not be familiar with, but I was in Chicago. And one of the sessions there was related to detecting deceit, and it was for specific situations like that. Because you have one person telling one story, one person telling another. As we've always heard, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Determining what really happened is a challenge. Now, if I'm understanding the question right, there may have been some documentation related to an individual that may play into this, absolutely. There are some other tips and tricks that were provided to at this session I went to that were designed to really get at the truth. Because if someone is actually lying, there are ways that you can ask the questions differently, ask them to tell the same situation in reverse, draw a picture of what happened, depending on the situation. Drawing pictures doesn't really fit and everything. But, and it was very interesting. So I would say that's really not a question I can answer with a yes or no answer, but I definitely think there are some additional skills or tips that can be used during an investigation to get at the best and hopefully accurate resolution. But those are tricky. If you have no witnesses and you have two people telling a completely different story, that's So leave of absence and time off policies. I kind of combine these into one. You're like, okay, this is supposed to be 5 policies, not 7. I put them together because they do sort of tie together in a lot of ways, and it was really hard to separate them. So leave of absence policies related to FMLA or sick leave are regulated. If you're required to comply with FMLA, it's 50 employees in a 75-mile radius. So many small employers are not required. Sick leave is really, again, there may be some number of employee stipulations, but also that's become very localized. Some states do it, some municipalities will do it. So if those do pertain to you, and in Iowa we don't have any at this point, although that's something that's gaining steam, so it may very well happen, those would need to be written into your handbook. But aside from that, we find that, aside from salary, vacation time and paid time off consistently rank as one of the most important factors to job seekers. So I deem this really important because in this day and age of the war for talent, as I will call it, these kind of policies can be a differentiator for you. So if if you've got someone considering two different businesses or organizations to work for, and one doesn't really offer much in the way of paid time off, and another one does, that might be the decision point for them. So I think it's important to take them into account, along with spelling out details related to them. But that's why I personally, for this time and age we're in right now, it's a really important policy to have in place, and can be your edge over the competition. Also last week, I'm trying to keep this somewhat timely. Last week, when I was at the convention, there was a Sheryl Sandberg. Everybody familiar with Sheryl Sandberg? She was one of the keynote speakers, and I find her very fascinating to listen to. And she talked about Facebook adjusting some of their paid time off policies. Now, obviously, nobody in this room is anywhere near the size of Facebook, I'm guessing. But, so they have the ability to do a little more. But one of her key points was that bereavement time, she felt like in most organizations was ridiculous, I mean, to put it bluntly. So they went to 20 days for bereavement time for someone who needed to be off for the death of an immediate family. And when you think about it, no one chooses to use that. It happens, and it doesn't happen that regularly, thankfully. So what is the harm? I mean, it was like one of those things where it's like, gosh, why haven't I thought of that? I could be Sheryl Sandberg. But it's, those kind of things make a big difference. This morning we were talking to a client about a PTO donation type policy. Again, a little bit off the subject, but again, not something that really costs anything because there's one, employee passing it to another, but a great policy to have in place for something that, building a culture. So it makes you just think, maybe some of these things that we just do day in, day out, maybe need to be looked at from maybe through a different lens to see if it still makes sense. Facebook also have 6 weeks of family leave to all employees, not just parents, to care for alien family members. And again, there's expense involved in all this, and not everybody would be able to do it, but I think it's interesting to see those who are doing it and maybe what the benefits of it would be. So, what to include in your leave of absence or time off policies? Well, again, the FMLA-related policy is pretty well cut and dried, and you're told what you would need to include and what the stipulations are related to the Family and Medical Leave Act, as far as reporting and tracking and all that kind of business. A guide for administering it consistently. And then the one that comes up quite often is personal leave. Do you have a personal leave policy? And if you don't, and your most favorite employee would like to take a personal leave and you want to grant it, be very careful that when the next person comes in and asks for the same thing, that you do the same thing. Again, that's where it gets very tricky to try to argue your point with an attorney if it comes like they say they were discriminated against because they were old. Let's just throw that out there as an example. And you don't really, what is your reason for denying it for one and not another? You may have a very good reason, but just something to be thinking about. It's like, especially if there's not a policy in place saying that there is or isn't, that whatever you do decide to do, you're being very, very consistent about it. And that one does, like I said, that does come up very often. And then in relation to just paid time off, so PTO versus vacation sick. How many people use a PTO plan? Okay. And then the rest are vacation sick separated? Okay. It's one of those things where the research I've done, it shows that there's a growing interest in PTO, and there's probably a variety of reasons for it, but one of them is that millennials, I'm sure some are in here are millennials, I'm sure, most have heard of them, really prefer flexibility. So the ability to use their PTO balance for whatever they choose is meaningful to them. So I think that's driving a part of it. It's also a little easier to administer on an employer side. And again, there are arguments to the contrary as well. But just one thing to think that through and just determine what direction you want to go with that. When and how employees would receive their PTO. Is it at their anniversary point, calendar years? Everybody's banks change at that point, and really looking through that. There are some financial implications of those. Is it an accrual, or does it come as a lump sum at the beginning of the year? Tiers based on seniority, or is it the same for everybody? And if there are tiers, how many? Unused days, carryovers, caps, payout. What does all that look like? And then there are state-specific requirements, especially when it comes to termination. So if in Illinois an employee terminates and they have accrued 80 hours of vacation time they haven't used, it's paid out. Now that would also include 80 hours of PTO. So that is a key decider for a lot of people. It's like, well, if I put it all in PTO, it's a larger balance that I have to pay out every time somebody terminates in Illinois. Well, if you're in Illinois, that would be a large consideration. In Iowa, for example, there is no law mandating payout of PTO or a vacation at termination. A lot of employers do it. That's perfectly fine. If you're not going to, it needs to be carefully spelled out in your policy that it does not get paid out upon termination. Or if you do for voluntary but not for involuntary or something like that. So again, just being very specific on what those rules are. And the other thing is just being, again, do market research. What are competitors doing that you would need to really have an understanding of in order to formulate your policy to make it, to make your organization the place that they would want to work. These non-salary related, salary is obviously a big, but the non-salary related benefits are becoming more and more a part of a decision for someone to join an organization. Culture is also a huge one. And so, again, I'm a little bit off the point, but building a culture that is readily apparent when someone walks into your organization is really, really key. First impressions. We've all heard the stories about first impressions. I mean, little things make a big impression. So thinking all those things through. One thing I wanted to back up to just for 1 second related to FMLA, just a little tip. And to make note of it, even though you have your policy spelled out in your handbook, if an employee, and this was a part of the blog article, did the blog article, Christina, go to the group? The blog, okay. Well, I wrote a blog, it's coming out next week. Yeah, okay. You'll be able to see it. So one of the examples I gave in there was related to FMLA, and it's important to note that an employee does not have to request FMLA to be eligible for it. Are you with me so far? Really, it's up to the employer to listen for clues, and this is where a lot of people get kind of caught up in things, where, especially when it comes to no call, no show policies or something. It's like, well, they no call 3 days, they're terminated, and nobody asks the question. And then you find out, oh, their mother was diagnosed with cancer. This person's been there long enough to be eligible for FMLA. We have a problem. So you have to be very careful with those things and just be aware that there may be reasons for it. Maybe somebody's come to work late consistently for the last 3 weeks, and it really hasn't been addressed regularly, but you're like, okay, you've hit, or maybe it's a no-fault term or a no-fault attendance policy. They're terminated. Again, same thing, you find out, oh, there was a sick family member. Well, that qualifies for FMLA. So should they have told you? Of course. Did they? They didn't. So you got to figure their mind probably isn't on that. So anyway, just things to keep in mind. So let's see. I think that's any questions about leave of absence or time off policies in general. There's a lot of noise out there related to the unlimited PTO. Does anybody do that? It's not as simple as it sounds. I'll just type it out. Yes,
can you address a question that I commonly get asked about people that have vacation and sick leave policies and they'd like to convert it to PTO, but they just don't even know where to start?
Yeah.
To try to do such a thing?
Yeah, so we've done that for a lot of clients, actually. It's kind of a project. I mean, definitely. There's really not, it's not necessary to just add them together, because in most cases, the people weren't using all of their sick time in general. So when you're merging the two together, you're probably going to come up with some number between their PTO accrual plus their sick, and kind of landed at a middle point. Transitioning out of it is the real tricky part, and that is usually phased in over a period of time to get to where they ultimately want to go. It's really hard to just one day be on vacation sick and then tomorrow start PTO, and it just doesn't work. It's hard to do it that way. Things are in process already, and it's impossible. So what we've historically done is kind of spelled out a timeline from, usually 6 to 9 months, maybe even a year. Especially if you're going from something where a vacation, let's say a vacation setup has been a rollover year after year after year, and there's not really been a cap. So we have balances that have built up to this huge number, and part of your reason to switch it is to also kind of level set a little bit. You have to be very careful about that, because it's sending a real horrible message to the employee that was piling it up. Why they were doing it, we don't know. But And so figuring out what is the transition looking like, allow them time so that they know it's going to happen so they could still use their vacation time as needed. You also then have to capture, factor in, when you don't want to have a run on the bank and everybody think they're going to go on vacation at the same time. But it's really carefully thinking out all the different details. And we have done that with a few clients recently that wanted to make that change. But yeah, it's like a project plan for sure. Any other questions? So the next is wage payment policy. And this one, I think, of any of them, some people would say, well, we pay according to the law, and we do. But I have seen this also come up in question related to someone who has a wage claim. Now, that's not EEOC related. That's through the Department of Labor. It's completely separate. But so your wage payment policy needs to express that the company's intention is to accurately compensate employees in compliance with all applicable state and federal laws, and make it widely known that we want to pay them what they are owed. The employee is responsible for ensuring all time worked is accurately reported. So some of this responsibility rests with the employee. It's important when responding to a DOL claim, so wage and hour claims, that we have these two things spelled out, depending on the situation. And then unused time off benefits, whether or not they're paid out of termination, which we talked about a little bit ago. So what would you include specifically in this policy? An explanation of overtime. So which hours count toward overtime? So we have some organizations pay, if they're open on a holiday, they have a premium pay on that day. Does that also count toward overtime? Sort of things like that. There are some unique, it's amazing how many different unique pay setups there are. Pay schedules. When does the pay period start? When does the pay period end? And this usually resolves most wage and hour claims. A lot of times they don't realize that organization's week starts on a Tuesday and ends on the following Monday. Now that is different than most, but we do have clients who have a varying type of a pay period. And then when is payday? Some of our semi-monthly clients may end, obviously with a 30th pay, but they don't pay it until the 15th of the next month, which is a long time in between. And that might be an exaggeration, but there's a gap for some of them. Some of them are really very, very quickly after. So making sure that's all clearly spelled out. Regulatory requirements related to what is deemed an exempt employee, what is non-exempt. Well, non-exempt employees are eligible for overtime. Exempt are exempt from overtime. There are also some other rules related to that. Payroll deductions, deductions for exempt employees, and this is related to if for exempt employees you can't just, if somebody leaves an hour early, you can't just take an hour off their time. There are some very specific restrictions related to that, or by doing that you've just turned them into a non-exempt employee and you owe them overtime. So you have to be very careful with that. Deductions for taxes, health insurance, etc. When do those happen? Is it every pay period? Pay cycles run, weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, semi-week or semi-monthly, and I think those are all of them. So, do my health insurance premiums come out every time, et cetera, et cetera. So just so they are aware of if a check doesn't look right, why that may be. Or maybe it looks different this time than it did the last time. The other couple things, do you require direct deposit? We're seeing a lot of businesses moving toward requiring direct deposit so they don't have to mess with handing out paychecks. There are some states that would not allow that to happen. Iowa is not one of them. As long as the employee has signed that they are aware of it and they get to choose the financial institution, it is an option. So something to look at. Again, depending on the size of the organization, that may or may not even make sense, but it's something that comes up every now and again. what are some of the prohibited practices? Well, working while off the clock is the one that comes up a lot. Buddy punching. So if I go home and forgot to clock out, I call my friend and they go to the time clock and put my number in. Now, if you're using a biometric clock, that wouldn't work. But if there is a way to do it, or it's a card, they grab your card, and that would be completely off limits. So making note of what those things that are prohibited are. And then what are the rules around meals and break periods? There's a lot of confusion around meals and breaks, and you'll have an employee tell you that you're required to give me a 15-minute break. Well, you're not. Now, if you've got a written policy saying you're going to, of course you would need to follow it, but there is no Iowa or federal law that forces or dictates that an employer has to offer meal or breaks, paid breaks or meals. So if you do offer a meal period, make sure it's 30 minutes unpaid. Breaks 15 to 25, to 20 minutes should be paid. So there's some general rules of thumb, but there's nothing that, and that's the one thing as a manager of an organization for many years, that was the first thing I was thrown up to, is like, you have to give me a paid break. No, I don't. No, we don't. We do, as much as possible. So employee conduct is my next one. We're going to wrap it up here in a few. And this one, just adherence to federal, state, and local regulations, protection of corporate reputation and assets, expectation of responsible action that avoids conflict of interest. And I'll give you some examples. And other situations that potentially could be harmful to the company, being ethical and honest. This is one that can go on and on and on. There's a lot of things you can include in this, but you can limit it as well. And this is the one where you think, well, some of this stuff should go without saying. But unfortunately, it doesn't. So it's worth calling out into your... I'm going to kind of speed this up a little bit because we're running a little bit short on time. Make a list of specific prohibited conduct in your policy. Violence, theft, disregard of safety rules, insubordination, false statements. I mean, all those things are just examples. Again, I've seen this list go like page long. So you can, you have to be very careful not to be so restrictive that you're infringing on rights that are given to them based on a different kind of a regulation, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So then acknowledgement. We've talked about that already a little bit. It is extremely important, and there are many times when we ask for it and it cannot be located. So please make a habit of getting a signed acknowledgement on every policy or handbook and keeping it in the employment file, so you know, employees file, so you know exactly where it is if it ever is needed. And then there's just a couple things about what you would include in the acknowledgement, that you have the right to change policies. You understand that the employee understands the company's policies. They understand that policies may change, and that this supersedes all prior agreements regarding employment. So if there was another handbook, they signed another acknowledgement. This one is now the rule. And yeah, that's the first thing that's asked for in litigation. And then I mentioned this already too, if at all possible, annually review your handbook, make necessary updates, and if changes are made, again, collect another acknowledgement, so that you have a record of that person understanding what was changed, so that you're not running into a challenge with they're looking at one rule and thinking they're going to get paid their PTO at termination, and you're looking at one that says we don't do that anymore. So you would probably, if you don't have a record that they've signed it, you're going to have to go back to the original. So real quickly, just a couple things to avoid, a few things to avoid. Being too restrictive in what the employees can and cannot say as it relates to working conditions. Social media posts, this comes up a lot. Employees can place things on social media. Where it becomes tricky, and I'm not saying everything's okay, but where if they are talking about the work, basically something about the work environment, and a couple of other people commented, that's protected and concerted activity, and it is deemed okay. They cannot be reprimanded for that. It's something that it's their right to do so. They're talking about working conditions other people may like. All they got to do is like it. They may comment, but if 2 or 3 people do that, that's protected and concerted activity. Now they can't go on and just blast the CEO about, I mean, there's rules and there's some stipulations here. Prohibiting employees from talking about pay. This used to be something that was written in handbooks years ago, like it's, against the rules to talk about what your salary is. It's definitely not a good idea by any stretch, but it is a violation of the National Labor Relations Act if we do restrict them from doing so, or take any sort of negative action because of it. Overly restrictive disciplinary, I talked about this a minute ago, and that's really related to FMLA. If there is a reason that would qualify for FMLA that you terminate them for without, just because they've had too many absences, that's going to be a problem, or could be a problem. No fault attendance policies. I'm sorry, that's that one. The overly restrictive disciplinary policy is if you need to always give yourself an out. So you have progressive, we do a verbal, we do a written, we do a final, you're termed. Well, you need an escape hatch in there that any of these steps can be skipped at any time based on the severity of the situation. And if that's not written in there, you can be held to, well, I didn't get my written warning before I was terminated. So you have to be very careful about that. Drug testing in Iowa without a very specific policy, training, and process. Everybody, if you have business in Iowa, I'm sure you're fairly familiar with that, if not very familiar. And then applying policies inconsistently. Like I said, if you do anything, make sure that, especially in the examples where you don't really have an officially written policy, that you're handling each instance the same. And when we consult with clients and they say they want to do something, whatever that may be, have you done this in the past? And what did that look like? So that we make sure that we're guiding them down the right path. So that's really all I had. Questions about anything so far?
We do have a question online. Okay. Stephanie is asking, does a salaried employee still need to be clocking in and out? I'm curious how this works with potentially false workers' comp claims for things that could have happened while not working.
Salaried employees should not be clocking in and out. Because that immediately gives the indication that they are hourly and that you're tracking the hours that they are working. And if that were to come up as a claim down the road and this person were to say, well, I didn't ever receive overtime, and they've clocked in and out, and their timekeeping records show that they were working 48 hours a week, you may end up having to go back and pay all that overtime. So it's of my opinion and many that you should never have, if you need to log their time for something, I would not have them clocking in and out in a timekeeping system. So that.
Yep.
Okay.
Other questions? We have a few minutes for questions, and Scott is here for free to answer those for you. So let's ask him good questions.
We have a question about dating the handbook. If you make an update to one policy within an entire handbook, should you? We have dates. We have the last updated date on the front, and then we also have dates on the bottom of the pages. Should you update the date just at the bottom of that page to indicate that's when that was updated? Take the dates off of every, and just, how would you handle that? If you're not updating the whole thing, you're just doing one specific part.
Yeah, what I would do is update the entire handbook, but I thought where you were going, well, first of all, when you said a dating question, I was a little concerned about that. No, I think the best thing to do, because in something like that, where let's say you have a policy manual that's 50 policies, you just updated one. There's really no need to make the whole staff review the entire handbook again. So you could pull that policy out, have them read it, and collect another acknowledgement of the changes made. Again, as long as it's kept with the original handbook acknowledgement, you're fine. So there's a variety of ways of doing it to collect the documentation that you would need. But yeah, I would probably just call it a revision of the entire handbook, but here's what changed, please sign here, that you understand. Yeah.
You had a question?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm violating one of the policies, and I want to know how much trouble I'm in.
Okay.
I tell an employee when I'm hiring them, I will pay you this amount, but do not tell anybody else because you may be getting paid more than a person you're working under, and if you do, that will be grounds for termination. What have I done wrong?
Yes, you are. I appreciate your candor. Yes, so that, as of the last, I don't know how many years, became something that the National Labor Relations Board, which generally you think of in relation to unions, has now stepped into the just private sector business and has said that that is unlawful. So while again, there's really no issue with encouraging them not to, because all it does is cause animosity. I mean, it's not going to end well. Let's just put it that way. Someone's going to be upset unless you just pay everybody the exact same amount of money. So it's not a problem to encourage them not to. I definitely wouldn't have a written policy about it. But it is not something you should be doing.
In NLRB, I have some workers that are union. Their wages are all set.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says, well, I'm making this, and the guy says, I'm making this, well, we understand because we're different levels of seniority.
Right.
But in my company, we aren't labor unions. And does NLRB really have anything to say to me?
They do.
How can they come into my business when I'm not a party to a labor agreement?
That is probably a question that many people have. They found a way to take those same, basically, rules and incorporate them into private sector. It's a very strange, between that one and private and concerted, or protected and concerted activity is another one that they've gotten involved in.
Is it free speech? Is that what we're violating? Why can't we restrict them?
It's just, and I mean,
Is it confidential information?
well,
Fall under confidentiality clause?
yes, and the thing is, now on the flip side of that, we're about to come to a point where now there's like traction gaining about wage disparity in general, and it's going to be common knowledge for everybody. So eventually, that's all going to. I honestly don't know why that became or where it came from exactly. There had to have been a case or something that prompted this whole thing to happen, but it's definitely not. If you took any sort of employment action against someone for sharing it, there could be trouble. Now, there's always a chance he won't. The person may not know the difference.
If I did that, would they report me to EEOC? And would EEOC back up what NLRB says?
They would. That one might be, I'm not sure EEOC would cover that one. That might be more of a Department of Labor claim, but in any way, in any stretch, yeah.
Okay, guys, we're going to wrap up.
Just because our simulcast is going to cut off. Let's thank Scott for his time today. Seriously, this was a wealth of information. I'm sure he'll hang around if you have some questions and we didn't get to them. And his email will also be in the thank you email that I send out as well. So you will have that as well. And somebody asked about the PowerPoint online. Are you okay if I send the PowerPoint out?
Sure.
Okay, so we will send the PowerPoint out to you as well. A couple quick events coming up I want to note. We have our female series, which is our First Friday series. It's typically on First Fridays, but with the holiday in July, it will actually be on the 13th. We have Susan Watts with Olson Larson Gallery will be our speaker, talking about her journey through entrepreneurship. And we have our top 5 in July 25th. And of course, we get these employees hired. We give them a great handbook. We, make it through all that, and then those employees leave. So what happens to our intellectual property when employees leave, and how do we protect that? So Davis Brown is going to come in and teach us 5 things we need to know about protecting that. It will be both an attorney in employment law and an attorney in IP coming to teach that in July. So that will be a great session to be at as well. I want to make a quick note. We hold a session called Capital for Your Business on August 2nd. It's limited to 20 people. It's a half-day session where we walk you through all the process of obtaining a loan, what those different loans are. We also talk about state programs available for funding as well as microloans, so that will be August 2nd. And then the big one is on November 9th. There are flyers on your table, our Small Business Success Summit. This will be the 2nd year for that. Last year we sold out. We anticipate selling out again at $79 for the whole day. Keynote this year, kicking us off, will be Google. Again, will be coming in telling us everything we need to know for 2019. And then we also have 2 other great keynotes that will be announced very soon. So a lot happening. There's even 2 more conferences, kind of workshops coming up that will be announced very shortly, one for September and one for October as well. So jump online, follow us. As he mentioned, there's a blog coming out, so check out our blog on Monday. Scott's will be posted on there with a little more information in there to circle you back. And if you have any other questions, you can always reach out to me, and I can hopefully get you to the right resource that you need. So thanks for being here today. Thanks for being online today, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.